The next project is a Merkava by Academy, and the reason for wanting to build this, it just looks very, very futuristic, and I've got a few photos that show lots of different kind of weathering on it, so that could be an interesting challenge. So let's see how we go. First thing to do is label the sprues to make it easier to find the different pieces. The detail was gradually added to the top of the tank and gradually building up the complete upper hull. The Merkava was developed by the Israeli army after the 1967 Seven-Day War and first came out in 1979 eventually. This particular model had a choice of two armour setups, and I decided to go for the first one, but rather than have one piece of plastic, I decided to chop the plastic up to make it a bit more interesting and a bit more realistic. The first thing I did was scribe the plastic and then with a saw chop it up into the individual pieces. Once I had separated all the pieces, I used a grinder just to thin them down a bit because they were rather thick, and the intention was to bend them slightly to make them look slightly damaged. Here you can see the difference between the original piece and the thinned down piece. Then a hairdryer was used to soften each armour plate up, hopefully without melting it, and then a pair of pliers just to bend and make it look a bit damaged. The kit came with some photo etch parts. This is the grill to the exhaust, and that will have to be super glued on rather than using the Tamiya extra thin cement which the rest of the build had. The armour plates can now be glued on, and where the armour plate was going on the grill, super glue was needed. And here's the finished hull with the armour plates separated and looking slightly damaged. Next we moved on to the turret. Armour plates glued on, detail gradually built up. Some of the pieces had seam lines which had to be trimmed off. The cupola was going to have some clear plastic sprayed blue to represent the glass. carefully glued together to try and get it as symmetrical as possible so we didn't get any ridge, because any sanding down is likely to flatten the curve of the turret, so special care was taken on this. Merkava has protection around the sensitive area of the turret, and the plastic came as one on the chains representing this. I thought I would drill them out, which did make them a little bit prone to breaking, but I thought it looked more realistic. Next up was the 3 machine guns that are mounted on top of the turret. Now we start on the lower hull, and this starts with the back of the lower hull. Unusually in a tank, the Merkava has the engine in the front of the vehicle, and this is added protection for the crew. Next, the wheels for the tank. Each one individually cleaned up. And the Merkava has a anti-slip paste all over it. So the model didn't have this, so to represent this, I used some VMS products, which is designed for this. You put on a little bit of the adhesive in the areas you want the anti-slip to go on, and once you've got the adhesive on, you dust over it and then tip off the excess. And then once it's dry, you can clean it up with a toothpick, and you have an anti-slip surface. Primed with Mr. Hobby primer. The wheels pushed into a sponge, and then the drawing tool used to give a mask, and you get a decent circle. The base coat was a mixture of grey and green. With some highlights on the some of the upper areas. The tracks were primed and then different browns applied to give a variation of shade. The tracks had to be stapled for them to go together. They weren't the best fitting tracks. And then some weathering on the lower hull with some airbrush thinner and some pigment. The start of making the tank dusty, as it were. The stowage areas of the tank were empty, so I made some balsa blocks which were going to be covered in tissue paper to just fill the area up. It looked a bit empty otherwise, I thought. Once the balsa blocks are glued together, they're covered in tissue, and then a mixture of PVA, glue and water is used to make the tissue adhere to the blocks. And once it's dry and painted, it looks like a tarpaulin. This is the piece of clear plastic painted clear blue and then cut up and put it into the cupola where the periscope is. The identification marks were a piece of plastic covered in the tissue again and then with a PVA mixture. The tank was weathered with a brownish filter just to make it darken a little bit. And then the final pigments were applied, mainly around the top of the armour plates where the sand would collect and then brush down to look like it had washed downwards with gravity. This is the end result. Thanks very much for watching.